Well, good morning, everyone. So the future looms large, I think, at the moment. I mean, not least because it's on a bloody big sign behind me. But we're used to talking increasingly, or pretending to understand, the fourth industrial revolution. We're conversant about AI and about machine learning, about automation. We have the non-stop roller coaster of fun, which is Brexit, to carry us through what will the future hold. But through all of that, I think the thing that we know will remain an important part of that is actually a fundamental set of skills, and that's really what I want to focus on today. So though the future has lots of uncertainty about it by its very nature, we actually know that if we take a step back, we see a trend which has pre-existed this decade, actually right back to the 1980s, where CBI called for a set of skills to be a core part of learning for every student. But the journey for me, really thinking about these skills and how do we build them for every student, began when I was a secondary school business studies teacher almost a decade ago. And what was clear to me working with 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds was that it was one thing for them to be on track with their qualifications, and of course that was a really fundamental part of what we were trying to do in that classroom. But at the same time, I couldn't help but worry about what the next step for them looked like. How were they going to thrive in college, or sixth form, or university, or in the world of work? Because there was a massive disconnect in my sense, some sort of yawning gap, it felt to me as that teacher in that classroom, between the support and the structure and the rigor I could put around supporting them in my classroom and actually what was going to go on and happen in the rest of their lives. And the question really was, how do we bridge that gap? And it's not just a gap that I saw in my classroom, but actually it's an area where there's remarkable consensus. So whether you're talking to educators, so Sutton Trust did a fantastic piece of work where it talked to teachers and parents and employers, and it found that 97% of teachers felt that there are a set of skills which were as important for students' future success as academic grades. And anyone can get 97% of teachers to agree to anything has really pulled something off. But also if you talk to colleges or universities, interestingly, universities are pretty clear that while of course they look at grades, of course they do through the UCAS process, they're also increasingly vocal about the importance of a set of what they're calling study skills, and actually say that the grades alone are not enough to support a young person to thrive at university. And in employment, we have the regular drumbeat of surveys, so CBI every year, but many other employer bodies as well, with that regular refrain that actually there's a gap between what employers perceive they need from new recruits and what they're finding as new joiners join them. So what might fill that gap? Well, it's not been like we've been short of ideas. So actually, as a new teacher, myself, starting to dig into some of this different area, there wasn't a shortage of potential things that might fill that gap. I've heard the phrase basic skills and the phrase advanced skills used about the same set of skills. I've heard them called key skills, transferable skills, employability skills, entrepreneurial skills, 21st century skills, and all the rest. The question is, that's all very well, but actually that doesn't help me in my classroom with an entire business studies curriculum or whatever else it is to teach, to actually do anything meaningful to support the skill development of my students, albeit that I care hugely about doing that. But what we did over the last few years is actually look at over 200 different frameworks and sets of skills that all fall into these different areas. And I learned two things from that. The first is that that's an exercise I would not wish on anybody. But the second was actually there's remarkable consistency in what is being called for. So actually, there are four areas that came up time and time again, albeit with slightly different language. One was around communication skills. One was around the ability to creatively solve problems. One was around self-management, and then the final area was around interpersonal skills. And actually what was interesting was that those were not only focused on in sort of employability frameworks that were targeted at students closest to the world of work, but actually resonated with what's going on at the early years. So with our 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, there was a remarkable consistency all the way through. And so what we've done with the Skills Builder partnership is we've looked at each of those areas and really tried to balance nuance and pragmatism and said there's a finite number of skills that anybody, whether you're a student, whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, can feasibly focus on. And we think 8 is probably the upper limit, and that works very nicely for us because actually each of those broad domains I mentioned can be divided up into pairs. So listening being the receiving of communication, presenting obviously the transmission of that, problem-solving creativity where the problem is clearly defined and where it's not, staying positive, the ability to keep sticking at plans, and of course aiming high, the ability to make those plans in the first case, and then leadership and teamwork depending on what your role is when you're working with others. And actually we find that that has pretty broad coverage. And so that's helpful to an extent, and through the Skills Builder partnership, which I'll mention, just having that commonality and that common understanding is useful. But it isn't that useful when I'm a busy teacher in my classroom, or an employer trying to support the development of these skills in a school that I'm working with. And actually the leap beyond that has to be to really understand, well, what does this skill, which we can all agree intuitively is a very helpful thing to have, how do we break that down into something that is actually meaningful and useful? And so if you take something like teamwork, when we're talking about 3 or 4-year-olds, what teamwork really is the ability to take it in turns. It's as simple as that. And as a father of a 4-year-old, we are really working hard on taking it in turns at the moment. But if we get through that, and we will get through that, the next thing we might look at is, helping out with different jobs. Or beyond that, making suggestions when working with others, or encouraging others, or resolving conflicts. And as a teacher of year 10 and 11, resolving conflicts was at the top of the list of what we wanted to do when we were working collaboratively. And beyond that, maybe measuring effectiveness and really understanding how a team is working. So actually we can take those skills, which can seem quite broadly sensible but quite difficult to break down, and actually break it down into those chunks. And that's what we've done over the last 4 years with the Skills Builder framework. And when you see it, and you must pick up your copy after this, when you see it, it probably looks intuitive or even obvious. But believe me, 4 years of hard work has created something which actually means that you can understand, I think probably for the first time, what listening looks like for a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, what we might expect of an 11 or 12-year-old, what that might look like in the workplace, and to try and build that understanding that we can collectively have. And as I said, we've worked through that for each of those 8 different skills to really move beyond a sense that these are useful things into actually what are the specific outcomes that I might want my students to achieve at different points. So that's exciting, but the other reason why I think it's exciting is, as I mentioned before, we're talking about the future a lot, but actually back in 1989, the CBI was calling for a set of employability skills to be consistently built across the education system. So why haven't we made that leap? And I think what's neat about having a clear breakdown of those skills is that it helps to defeat 3 key myths, which I think hold us back collectively. I think the first is the idea that we slip into far too easily, which is that the skills are innate. So we use the language of natural learners, natural leaders, natural collaborators, I think far too easily. Sometimes forgetting that the flip side of that is that we assume that some students won't be able to develop some of those skills. And I have to say that in 9 years of running Enabling Enterprise, and we've worked with well over 200,000 children and young people in that time, I've yet to see, with the exception of very specific special educational needs, students who can't build all 8 of those skills to a high standard, and I think we can have a much higher expectation against that. I think the second is that we can sometimes see these skills as being slightly mysterious. So we like them, we like these skills, but actually we're not very clear on how you build them. So we do activities that use the skills, and we hope that if we do enough activities that use the skills, they might rub off. And so we get this idea they're picked up by osmosis. The third myth, I think, is that we sort of hope that the skills lie latent. So come the right opportunity, actually those skills will present themselves. And I think that's a little bit of a layover from that sort of entrepreneurial myth, that come the right opportunity, the skills will present themselves. And unfortunately, there's just no evidence for that, albeit that would save us a lot of time if that worked. And in fact, what we've found through a Skills Builder partnership is that there's a big leap of imagination we need to make when it comes to these skills. We need to move beyond the idea that these are nice to have, but somehow mysterious or innate, and actually think about them in the same way we think about 2 skills that we're perfectly comfortable teaching in school, which is, of course, literacy and numeracy. And I would suggest that actually literacy and numeracy are much more complex skills to master than some of these other skills. But what we've done is we've thought about, well, if we're comfortable teaching those, what are some of the principles that underpin building those skills really effectively, and how can we transfer those principles into the development of these other skills? And so that gives us a set of 6 principles that we found across hundreds of schools are remarkably consistent with those schools who are really being able to transform these outcomes for students. The first is to keep it simple. So we've already mentioned this can be an area where there's a huge fog of language. And actually the fog of language just reduces the understanding of the student and the parent and the teacher and any employers who they interact with. So actually having that simple, consistent set of 8 skills all the way through school life, all the way through that journey, really helps the students to have that consistent conceptual framework to be able to apply different experiences to that achievement of those consistent 8 skills. Second is we start really early. So we start working with 3- and 4-year-olds, despite originally me thinking this would be a quick fix for my 15- and 16-year-olds, because actually what we found is that students turning up on their first day at school have the same differences in these skills as they do in literacy and numeracy. So in the same way that you get kids on the first day who can write their name, recognize letters, do some basic counting, you have students who can walk in on their first day of school, happily introduce themselves, sit down, happy to leave their parents or carers behind, and those who simply haven't developed those those basic steps of essential skills to be able to do that. So we start really early so that the gap doesn't develop into something that's insurmountable later on. We then measure it. And that's not about turning these skills into a league table measurement, but it's about saying that actually, if we understand out of that breakdown of the skill what students can do and what they can't do, then of course we can focus our energies much more effectively. And we have the added bonus that by doing that, we can also see progress in a really tangible, meaningful way, which is rewarding, I think, as educators or as others working with students. It's rewarding to be able to understand and to see the impact. The fourth principle is around focusing tightly, which means taking the time to explicitly teach us skills. So rather than running endless group activities where we hope that a student can work out that it's quite helpful to divide up roles in a team, we could instead spend 5 minutes teaching them how to divide up roles in a team, practice it and reinforce it explicitly a couple of times, and then they've got that concept thereafter. That means keeping practicing as well. And then the final principle that we've seen is that these skills are as useful as they are transferable. So what we want to do is to always make sure that students are seeing these skills not just as something that's useful in a particular lesson or particular after-school club, but in something that they can use in all different aspects of their life, including their home life, including in work experience, and throughout what they're going to do beyond that. So we have, as I said, over the last 4 years, developed that language, those clear shared outcomes, and principles to help actually apply that and to achieve those outcomes. But the critical thing, and I think the reason why we haven't had a breakthrough on this to date, is that we have to do that together. A shared language is not a shared language until it's shared. Common outcomes are not common outcomes until they are commonly held to be the right outcomes for students. And so what's been great to see over the last couple of years is a real upsurge in schools who are using this really effectively to build the skills of their students in a really rigorous, incremental way to really take every student on that journey all the way through. So well over 100,000 students completed one of the programs last year. But at the same time, we know that engagement of employers is absolutely critical. And that's not just by engaging directly with schools, but by reinforcing those skills in lots of different settings. So whether it's EY's work experience program, or whether it's BP's online resources, or whether it's TUI hosting groups of students in on a trip, all of those things, if they're using that common language and understanding of the outcomes we might be expecting, can help to reinforce that and mean that it's not just a nice experience, but actually something that contributes to a really transformational long-term journey. And then the final thing is not just working with schools and employers, but actually realizing that there are lots of people who really care about this stuff in the sector. And so we're really excited that this is not just about one provider's program, but actually is a framework that's now being used by well over 30 different organizations, including organizations like Business in the Community or the National Literacy Trust. And actually that means that when a school is working with lots of different partners, as it probably will do on a good careers program, actually all of those different elements join up as well. So students can see the coherence of everything that they're getting the opportunity to do. So we've made a good start, I think, and it's really exciting to see the momentum and energy behind resolving this particular challenge when it comes to ensuring all kids have the skills for the future. In terms of the practicalities, of course, we know that there are huge pressures in schools. And so what we've got, and I hope you get a chance to talk to my colleagues after this who are out on the stand, but we've developed, along with other partners, a whole suite of resources that means that teachers and employers can pick up and use this framework right away. So that includes fully designed lessons, it includes short video activities that can be built into form periods or into other points in learning. It includes a really broad teacher training offer, so an offer of CPD, and then also assessment tools that can be used by students themselves or by teachers to understand their classes. So there's a whole load of stuff that already exists out there, and critically, which can plug into what you're already doing rather than saying this has to be instead of anything that is already a well-established program in your school. And as you can see, it's all beautifully branded, so that's good too. And so just to finish, what's really exciting about all of this is not the fact that there's the intellectual coherence behind this skill or that there are beautifully branded resources, but in fact, what then happens in schools and how each school takes the framework and the resources that are available and turns it into something which is exactly right for their students. It builds on their existing program, it builds on their providers. So for example, Caister Academy is part of the Creative Education Trust, and the big focus that they wanted to have was they wanted every student in Key Stage 3 to understand these skills, to know what they meant for them, and to be able to build those skills across other learning as well. So we worked with them to introduce that language to their teachers, to run challenge days with every student so they could practice their skills on different challenges, and then to have those reinforced in every lesson after that. Equally, we worked with Queen's Park High School up in Chester, and for them, they wanted to put the development of these essential skills on the same par as development of academic understanding. And so one of the things that they did was that they assessed the essential skills of every student at the beginning of the year, giving the students that understanding of where they were and what the next steps were for them, but also meaning that they could engage parents and their employer partners, who are Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, in that conversation too. So another really neat example of taking that and using that to support brilliant activity that was already going on. So just to conclude, I think we're in a really exciting place now. We've done the hard graft in terms of trying to draw together an academically thoughtful and rigorous approach to breaking down those skills. More excitingly, we've seen principles that actually mean that schools can consistently apply those and achieve those outcomes on the framework. And even more so, we've now got this growing partnership of over 500 organizations with that common vision. And the common vision is that every child and every young person will need to build the essential skills to thrive in the future, and that every child can build those skills to thrive in the future as well. And we hope you'll join us. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. Incredibly engaging and very funny, actually. Any questions for our Tom? I made him part of my family there. Oh, Tom.
Yeah, no, it's nice. Nice to be included.
Any questions for our Tom? A big one for me, you talked about the 8 different disciplines and skills that people have to know and the levels that they are. Are you getting any sense of a particular emphasis from some of the educators in terms of where they see their priorities from their pupils?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think that's one of the most important reasons, I think, to start by really understanding the existing skills of students, because what we found is tremendous variation across every school about where students start in different things. And often that's down to what the existing provision looks like or the ethos of the schools. As you can imagine, Creative Education Trust, they come out pretty well on creativity as a starting point, but actually there are different gaps in different places as well.
Anyone from the floor? There's a question here.
Yeah, you talked about getting these skills into the classroom and students, but there are
No, you're absolutely right, but that's one of the sort of fundamental things that we really are working on, which is, and we've developed some really exciting partnerships with some of those organizations, and we've got conversations with a lot more of them developing as well, because that's the dream scenario, right, is that the students have this wonderful range of extracurricular opportunities as well, but as well as being worthwhile experiences in their own right, just by drawing out the same language and the same outcomes, it means that whether it's Scouts or whether it's NCS or whatever else it is that students are doing, also help them to plug back into developing that broad set of skills well. So that is absolutely at the front of my mind at the moment. Thank you.
Partnership, fantastic. One more. Just the gentleman just at the back there. Who's going to get to him first? Blue or green? Blue or green? Race, run. Oh, look at that. The future is female. Well done, Jasmine. Well done.
It's all about having commitment. Should have just kept going. Tom, you and I know each other, but could you just put a little bit of light on, we've got a room full of educators here mainly. What's been the attitude and approach that you've seen from employers to seeing the framework and what it means to them and how they might get involved?
Before you do that, we don't know you, so who are you?
My name's Andy Smythe. I'm from TUI. Tom kindly referenced us earlier.
Great. So I think what's been really interesting, so there are two elements. I mean, one is that when we developed this framework, I think I probably should have been more clear that this wasn't simply something that we sat down and came up with. It was something that involved over 60 different organizations and some of our 130 employer partners too, to make sure that this was not just skills that were useful to build in that school context, but were exactly the skills that employers were consistently calling for. And so I think the response from employers has been overwhelmingly positive, actually. And what's been exciting has been seeing how often employers are now shifting some of the materials and some of the workshops that they offer to schools to make sure that it's aligned against that same framework. Because I think there's a real appetite from employers. I think employers who work with schools want to make sure that they're having a genuine outcome and an impact, even if they've only got a short amount of time. And so actually feeling like, you know, we can't necessarily transform teamwork in 1 hour, but what we can do is we can pick one particular step, one particular outcome, and in an hour we can teach and practice this element, and we can help make sure that all the students are making those steps of progress. So yeah, the response has been really positive on both fronts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for Tom.